In 1981, a scientist stood beneath a single tree in a Chinese mountain village and felt, not relief, but fear. 7 birds. That was the entire surviving population of a species that had once ranged from Siberia to the South China Sea. Not 7 in China, 7 on Earth. 2 breeding pairs, 3 fledglings, 1 tree, and the man standing beneath it had spent the last 3 years traveling more than 50,000 kilometers across 14 provinces, preparing to declare them gone forever. His extinction paper was already written. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly how 7 birds, guarded by 4 people with butter smeared on a tree trunk, accidentally constructed a multi-billion yuan agricultural empire, expanded a wilderness habitat by a factor of 3,000, and forced one of the most dramatic rewrites of regional economic policy in modern Asian history. Not through a conservation program, not through government investment. Through a single county-level decree that banned chemical fertilizers. That is the mechanism. That is what this file documents. But here is the detail the official recovery narrative does not foreground. The Shaanxi County government issued its emergency protection orders 4 days after the discovery. No hunting, no logging, no pesticides, no firearms, 4 round-the-clock guards posted at the nesting site. On the surface, a standard emergency conservation response, bureaucratic, procedural, expected. The scientific literature records it as a textbook crisis intervention. What the literature does not explain is why, by the early 2000s, the farmers who had been ordered to abandon modern agriculture as an economic sacrifice were generating premium grain revenues that urban markets could not source anywhere else on the continent. Liu Yinzeng was an ornithologist at the Institute of Zoology of the Chinese Academy of Sciences. His 3-year search had taken him and his colleagues through 14 provinces on a systematic documentation mission commissioned by the state. Every lead had collapsed. Every reported sighting had resolved into a misidentification or a sighting too old to verify. By the spring of 1981, the scientific consensus was not a hypothesis, it was a conclusion. The crested ibis, Nipponia nippon, had been extirpated from China, Korea, Japan, and Russia within the span of 2 decades. The causes were documented: pesticide contamination of foraging wetlands, habitat conversion, hunting pressure during the agricultural expansion of the mid-20th century. The file was closed. Before submitting his paper, Liu made one final field visit to Shaanxi County, to the southern slopes of the Qinling range, acting on a second-hand report from a local forestry worker named Liu Yinzeng, who described, without particular confidence, a bird matching the ibis description seen near a village called Yaojiagu. Liu did not expect to find anything. The report carried no scientific credibility. He went because the paper required exhaustion of every lead, however thin. On May 23, 1981, in a stand of oriental oak above terraced rice fields at an elevation of roughly 1,200 meters, he found them. 2 breeding pairs, 3 fledglings, 7 birds carrying the complete genetic future of a lineage that had existed for 60 million years, nesting above a farming village whose residents had no scientific awareness of what lived in the canopy above their fields. The last known population of the species anywhere on Earth, in a single tree, in a county with no infrastructure, no conservation funding, and no framework for what came next. The emergency orders followed within 96 hours. 4 guards, greased bark, a foraging zone stripped of every chemical input the surrounding farmland had relied on for 2 decades. What happened to the rice those farmers grew under that restriction is the precise data point that the economic planners had entirely failed to predict. And what the Japanese government attempted to do with the birds China later exported to Sado Island, using hyper-automated tracking infrastructure and industrial coexistence protocols, set off a regulatory war between farming cooperatives and state environmental ministries that is still unresolved. The mountains did not need engineering. That is the finding. What the engineering cost is the invoice we are about to open. Before we track the radical legislative mechanism that single tree triggered, we need to baseline our own map. Drop a comment right now with the state or county you are watching from, and tell us whether your region is currently facing its own agricultural or environmental collapse. Subscribing to this channel keeps you pinned to the data as we expose the metrics the mainstream continues to ignore. Now, back to the mountains, because the official story was about to hit an immediate structural shock. Now here is what you need to understand about the biology of the crested ibis, because it is the biology that made the lockdown inevitable and the lockdown that made the economics impossible to predict. The crested ibis does not forage in forests. It does not hunt in open fields. It wades. It requires shallow, slow, chemically undisturbed water, flooded rice paddies, marshy field margins, silted stream banks, probing the mud with a long curved beak for loaches, freshwater crabs, frogs, and invertebrates that live only in substrate that has never been treated with synthetic inputs. The bird is, in the most precise operational sense, a living water quality instrument. Where the chemistry is wrong, the food chain it depends on collapses. Where the food chain collapses, the bird does not adapt, it disappears. This is what the Yangtze County government understood within 96 hours of the May 23 discovery, not as an ecological principle, as an immediate operational constraint. 7 birds, 1 foraging valley, any chemical application upstream, and the substrate those birds depended on would be sterilized. The margin for error was not thin, it was non-existent. The emergency decrees that followed were not suggestions. Hunting was prohibited across the entire protection zone. Logging of nesting trees was prohibited. The discharge of firearms or explosives within the breeding perimeter was prohibited. 4 people were stationed at the nesting site permanently, 2 shifts, around the clock, logging every behavior, every feeding movement, every interaction. The bark of the nesting trees was coated in grease to prevent snakes from ascending. These were not conservation protocols developed in a laboratory. They were triage measures written in real time by county administrators who understood that a single predation event, a single nest failure, a single bad season could end the genetic line of a 60-million-year-old species before any recovery infrastructure existed to prevent it. And then came the decree that no one in that county had anticipated. To preserve the ibis foraging zones, the specific subaquatic mud layers the birds required, the local government banned all modern chemical fertilizers, all synthetic pesticides, and all commercial logging across the entire valley floor. Not in a buffer zone, not in a designated wildlife corridor. Across the operational agricultural land that the farming families of Yangtze County had been working with industrial inputs for 2 decades. The farmers of Yangtze County understood this before the scientists. The environmental restriction was initially framed as a catastrophic economic sacrifice. And they were not wrong to frame it that way. These were not wealthy landowners with diversified income. These were subsistence and near-subsistence farming households whose yields depended directly on the chemical productivity inputs that had defined Chinese agricultural modernization since the 1960s. Removing those inputs was not an environmental gesture. It was a structural regression. Yield projections dropped. Input costs restructured. The entire economic logic of the valley was being reorganized around the foraging requirements of 7 birds that most of the county's residents had never seen. Think about that, 7 animals, an entire agricultural economy rewired by county decree in under a week. Tracking these multi-layered institutional pivots requires an audience that values hard empirical metrics over surface-level environmentalism. If you demand this level of investigative ground truth, take a second to hit the subscribe button and join our independent research collective. Now look closely at the financial ledgers, because by the early 2000s, this economic regression turned into an absolute goldmine. Because what the Yangtze farmers could not have known in 1981, what no economic planner in the provincial government had modeled, what no agricultural ministry projection had anticipated, was what happens to rice when you remove every synthetic input from a high-altitude mountain watershed and let the water run clean for 20 years. The grain that came out of that valley was not ordinary grain, and the markets that eventually found it were not paying ordinary prices. The data on what came next is not disputed, it is simply staggering. And what happened to the rice they grew is the precise data point that the economic planners had entirely failed to predict. The high-altitude runoff from the Qinling watershed, untouched by fertilizer, pesticide, or industrial discharge for nearly 2 decades, had produced something that China's urban commodity markets had no established category for: zero synthetic residue, measurable across the entire supply chain. The grain coming out of Yangtze County was achieving purity ratings that certified organic networks in eastern China could not replicate at any price. The market did not need convincing, it paid. The regional government moved quickly. 32,000 hectares of valley farmland converted into a certified organic network. The ibis rice designation became a regional brand commanding premium prices in Shanghai, Beijing, and Guangzhou. Tourism infrastructure followed. Then export licensing. Billions of yuan in annual regional revenue generated not by investment, not by development, but by the enforced absence of chemistry. The wild population, from 7 to over 10,000 birds. The montane forest habitat, from under 5 square kilometers to over 16,000, without humans planting a single tree. Not managed, not engineered, vacated. But China is not the only country where a bird pulled back from the absolute edge of extinction has completely rewritten the agricultural rules. If you thought 7 ibises rebuilding a regional economy in Shaanxi was unexpected, wait until you see the trade warfare on Sado Island. Sado Island sits in the Sea of Japan, 30 kilometers off the coast of Niigata Prefecture, a rice farming island with one of the most intensively managed agricultural landscapes in East Asia. When China's diplomatic conservation program delivered the first pair of crested ibises to the Sado Japanese Crested Ibis Conservation Center in 1999, the Japanese government did not respond with restraint. It responded with infrastructure. Automated GPS tracking systems, captive breeding facilities engineered to precise humidity and temperature tolerances, a nationwide reintroduction protocol coordinated between the Ministry of the Environment and the Agency for Cultural Affairs, a species management framework that had taken 2 decades and hundreds of millions of yen to design. Japan deployed against this problem everything that Yangtze County had never had. And then the birds began foraging in the paddies. The same foraging biology that had accidentally purified a Chinese mountain watershed was now landing inside one of Japan's most chemically intensive agricultural production zones. The ibis required the same thing it had always required: clean, unmedicated mud, slow water, undisturbed substrate. Japanese farming cooperatives in Niigata Prefecture had operated on synthetic inputs for half a century. The collision was not metaphorical. It was a regulatory collision, measured in pesticide quota disputes, compensation claims, and ministerial review cycles that are, according to Japanese environmental governance records, still ongoing. Not a conservation problem, not a diplomatic problem, an agricultural compliance war. This regulatory friction between automated agriculture and native biology is unfolding globally. For those of you watching from major agricultural zones across the United States or Canada, let us know in the comments if you've seen local farming guidelines get completely upended by endangered species regulations. Your localized field reports keep our independent mapping accurate. Now, look at the final invoice for this international cross-exchange. Because the contrast between these two outcomes, one valley that surrendered its chemistry and accidentally built a billion-yuan economy, and one island that deployed every available engineering tool and produced a regulatory war, is not a coincidence. It is the finding. And the final invoice has a number attached to it that reframes everything that came before. If a single-digit remnant of a species can accidentally construct a multi-billion yuan agricultural empire simply by forcing humans to step backward, we must ask what unseen economic power we are actively crushing in our own landscapes. 7 birds, 1 county decree, 20 years of enforced chemical absence, 32,000 hectares of certified organic land, 16,000 square kilometers of recovered forest, 10,000 birds in the wild, billions of yuan in annual revenue, not one tree planted by human hands. The question is no longer whether passive rewilding produces economic value. The evidence closed that question in Yangtze County over 2 decades ago. The question is how many landscapes we are currently spending millions to mechanically maintain, engineering, managing, intervening, while the systemic repair is already encoded in the biology, waiting only for us to stop. China did not build an empire in the Qinling Mountains. It accidentally discovered one by removing itself from the equation. Japan tried to engineer the same outcome and produced a regulatory war instead. The variable between those two results is not technology, not funding, not political will. It is the willingness to surrender. What other industrial systems are we spending millions of dollars to mechanically maintain, while nature is offering the systemic cure completely for free? Drop your final thoughts below alongside your location, and if this case file permanently changed how you look at environmental data, subscribe to this channel. Because in our next investigation, we move from the high-altitude mountains of China directly to the vulnerable coastlines of Western Europe. A Dutch water infrastructure company ignored 40 years of uniform scientific literature and released exactly 3 900-kilogram bison onto a dead, encroached sand dune. The establishment predicted immediate biological failure. What those 3 animals did to a coastline that decades of human engineering had completely failed to restore left global ecologists stunned. We will open that file next. The mountains did not need engineering, they needed us to leave.